All right, back with you, Tom Gresham, 866-TALK-GUN, or just call me at Tom Talk Gun. In the world of firearms and self-defense, there are a lot of folks with opinions. There are a lot of folks with megaphones, outlets. And then there are those who you probably really should listen to. Many years ago, I created the first television series about personal defense with firearms. It was called PDTV, Personal Defense TV. And there had been nothing like it before. And when I created it, I said, the one guy we have to have on this, the guy we need to make this work, is Massad Ayoob. He is the preeminent firearms trainer. He's been an expert witness for 40 years on firearms issues, a law enforcement expert, a trainer, a competitive shooter, and it worked out exceptionally well, as you might imagine. And so when it came time today to talk about what's going on in the world and how it's changed, or maybe not, I said, we got to get this guy on. So my good friend Massad Ayoob joins us right now. How you doing, Mass?
Doing great, Tom. It's good to be back on the show.
Absolutely great to have you here. So I mentioned that, all that's changing with the world, and we're watching the riots and watching the thing, and yet, if you've been watching this kind of stuff and writing about it as you have, you've written thousands of magazine articles, more than a dozen books. What do they say? The more things change, the more they stay the same, right?
Yeah, in a lot of ways, but right now the operative part of that is the more things change.
True.
The big concern I'm hearing from the armed citizen community lately is, look, if we take a wrong turn and get caught up in one of these riots, what are we supposed to do?
Yes.
And the first thing they've got to look at legally is that historically, for a very long time, really as long as we've been a country, it was understood that if a mob is attacking you, every member of the mob is a legitimate target, assuming they have no right to be attacking you, because they're seen by the law as a single organism, and because every member of the mob shares the responsibility of the deadly threat, every one of them is absolutely vulnerable to the armed citizen's response. What has changed and what we're seeing now, I think the best explanation I've heard of it came from a friend of mine whose name I can't use because he's with a very large metropolitan police department. Mm-hmm. But he said what we have now is not the mob with shared intent, the single organism like the blob or the herd of zombies on Walking Dead.
Right.
What we have now is a crowd of people who, for the most part, have sincere, benevolent concerns, whether or not those concerns might be misplaced in some respects, but they have been infiltrated by Antifa, by assorted criminals, by the looters, the rioters, and he sees them as the sharks that are swimming in a sea of protesters. So it's no longer the amorphous mechanism, the amorphous mob.
Right.
Every member of that crowd, when two or three of them come out of it to attack you, is not a legitimate target anymore. You're going to need very precise target identification and very precise defensive shooting if it comes to that.
I get all that, and I agree completely, because we have and I have come to call them terrorists, because if you attack people and burn down buildings with an eye toward changing the behavior or the policies of an outfit or a country, I consider that terrorism. But yes, I agree. They're the ones that are in the third row, fourth row back, throwing the bricks and rocks and frozen water bottles and the IEDs, when the folks in front just showed up to try to seek redress on issues, and they're there legitimately. So I get that. Now we get to the now what, the therefore part of it, which is if you're in the middle of this, and it's just happened in Austin, Texas, where this Army sergeant, who is an Uber driver, gets caught up in this, and a man runs up to him and shoves an AK-47 in his face, points it at him, and the driver shoots and kills the protester and then drives off. What is one to do?
Well, I can certainly understand why he did as he did, and I can certainly understand why he has not been arrested, though they say the investigation is continuing. Basically, once they start trying to drag you out of the car, once they point a deadly weapon at you, your threat is identified, and the mob is no longer a factor. It's a felonious criminal aggressor who's acting out obvious homicidal intent, and he has become a legitimate target. Unfortunately, it's very likely that the backstop is going to be a whole lot of well-meaning 19-year-old college kids or something.
Right.
And that's why absolutely certain target identification and precision shooting capability is important. One thing that really troubled me is seeing some people recommend, well, it's a mob, so carry your 7.62 NATO rifle in the car with you loaded with ball, so it'll shoot through three of them and you can get three with one shot, which means you've just guaranteed you're going to shoot the bad guy, hopefully if your aim is correct, and you're going to shoot the two unidentified people behind him before that bullet comes to a stop. So, in the immortal words of John Dean, who was talking about something else at the time, that information is no longer operative. Your defensive firearm is going to need to be loaded with something designed to stay in the human body. Because callous as it sounds, when you have to fire on the street, the body of your homicidal attacker is the only backstop that you have. And there's a crowd behind him.
Very interesting point. And so that brings us to choice of firearm, choice of caliber, and choice of ammunition. And not to mention, of course, the fact that you need to be precise and you need to know what you're doing.
Well, when I was recently in Portland, I happened to be carrying a Beretta 9mm with, as you might imagine, 2 spare magazines under the circumstances. And usually I carry something like the 124 grain Spear Gold Up Plus P.
Right.
It passes all the FBI tests, good for barricade penetration and all that. For that, I loaded the gun with 115 grain Plus P Plus. It'll generally, in flesh simulating gelatin, cause a 10 to 11 inch wound channel, but a very wide one, and it's much more likely to stay within the body if you're forced to shoot under those very precarious circumstances.
And then we have the argument that says just hit the accelerator and drive over all of them to get away.
Well, if you're going to do that, again, it depends. If they're blocking, if you took the wrong turn off the highway and there's a bunch of people yelling, waving placards, and blocking your path, do not run over them. For all you know, at least one incident in Seattle, the police had issued a permit for them to block an interstate highway. As ridiculous as that sounds, talk about pandering. But if they are legally marching there and you decide to drive through them, you are going to be seen by the courts and by the jury pool as the guy in Charlottesville who rammed his car into 20 people, injuring all of them and killing one, and who's now serving a sentence that, if I recall correctly, the judge sentenced him to life plus 400 years. So first, don't be the vehicle against another human being is a deadly weapon. Unless you are under attack, physically under attack. They're trying to rip you people out of the car. Don't be shooting. Don't be putting the wheels to them. When they start trying to break into the car, the analogy I would use is, look, you don't crack a walnut unless you intend to consume the contents. You don't crack into the closed motor vehicle, which many states actually see as an extension of your home under Castle Doctrine, unless you intend to do harm to the soft occupants inside. They start trying to drag people out of my car and break the windows and stuff and pull us out. It's deadly force time, one way or the other. If they're simply blocking the path, do not run into them. If you have an emergency, it would not hurt. I remember the old days before GPS and all that, when we had CB radios in our cars, and most of them had a loudspeaker system like a patrol car radio.
Right.
You could broadcast your voice outside the car. These situations make me wish for one of those. If you don't have something like that, lay on the horn, turn on your emergency flashers, and let the world know. Let those 100 iPhone cameras that are videoing the incident see. Right. You see yourself in an emergency, you are slowly trying to get out of it from the situation, right. Not trying to see how many people you can knock over like a bowling ball knocking over 10 pins.
And then, of course, there's always the thing of, if you know there's a situation, you know there's going to be a riot, don't go down there, which leads me to hand you off to your favorite Ogden Nash quote.
I said it on your show before on Personal Defense TV, and I'll say it again. When called by a panther, don't answer.
Massad Ayoob, don't go anywhere. We're going to come right back. 866-TALK-GUN. This is Gun Talk. We're talking with Massad Ayoob, obviously world-famous firearms trainer and expert in legal use of firearms and self-defense. Mass, I was thinking, and I should mention, by the way, that you are, of course, one of the principals, one of the main people who gets called if your folks are involved in the Armed Citizens Legal Defense Network. You get called. You've had 40 years of work in the courtrooms as an expert witness. One of the things I was going to ask you about, I kind of get an impression for a lot of gun owners who think if they get into a shooting, if they get into a situation, they end up being in court, it's going to be, well, I can explain my way out of this. And I want to talk to them about this, but I'd love to have you explain. You could get a prosecutor who really is there not to find out what's right or wrong, but to put you in jail. Is that overstating the case?
Well, not really. The great majority of prosecutors are honest people. They understand that their role is not to mindlessly prosecute everyone who's, run afoul of law enforcement. And they're supposed to be a minister of justice. They're equally bound to exonerate the innocent. Mm-hmm. You do have a few who, either out of ignorance of self-defense issues, which are barely touched upon in 3 years of law school, or for political reasons, will hang you out to dry. If you go to lawofselfdefense.com, the website of our friend Andrew Branca, who's kind of in the same business I am, he recently put out a list of many of the prosecutors that George Soros has given huge amounts of money for, 6- and 7-figure contributions to their campaigns, to put them in office. Those include Kim Fox, the very anti-police prosecutor in Chicago, Cook County. That includes the prosecutor who brought the McCloskey case recently in St. Louis. And one can't help but notice a correlation that the cops don't see a reason to arrest someone, but suddenly the prosecutor who was funded by an anti-gun outside source suddenly decides it is expedient to prosecute. Normally almost unheard of. Let
me jump in because I don't want people to think, well, wow, these guys are really going down the conspiracy wormhole here. Actually, the whole deal about George Soros being involved and contributing to the campaigns of these people, it's out there. It actually became part of the discussion in the case of the prosecutor in St. Louis. And she said, I'm perfectly okay taking the George Soros money. And one is led to ask the legitimate question, what is it that Soros wants out of this? Because you don't give tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars to the campaign of prosecutors without expecting something in return.
Well, I can't read the man's mind, but I think any of your readers or listeners, if they do their due diligence and if they can spell Google, which I'm sure they can, will make the same connection you and I did and act accordingly. If we start to see a pattern of political prosecution, we know that if we live in that particular area, we have to have our ducks in a row. It will be all the more important to belong to one of the organizations like Armed Citizens Legal Defense Network, which I'm involved in on the board of advisors, that will, in a legitimate self-defense situation, pay your enormous legal fees.
Exactly right. And you need to know on the front end, the best solution to all this is to not get yourself into a situation, or certainly not to make it worse, which kind of brings me all the way back to the training you do with your MAG 20, MAG 40 training. And so much of that is not firearms training, but legal training about what you can do, what you should do, and many times more than anything else, what you shouldn't do. Fair enough?
Yeah, I describe my course as a strong minor in how to shoot a gun effectively and a strong major in when to shoot your gun effectively and what to do after the last piece of brass stops rolling on the pavement.
For in case in point, you'll hear people forever say, well, if you get into a shooting, just don't talk to the police. Just tell them, I want to talk to my lawyer. And you point out that may not be the best course of action for you.
Well, what I've seen over the years, Tom, and in my first book on this 40 years ago, I gave the same advice because every criminal defense lawyer, every judge I talked to said, don't talk to the police. Mm-hmm. It's whatever you say is going to be turned against you. And it took me a while in the criminal justice system, 43 years as a cop, as you noted, 40 years as an expert witness, to realize that the reason defense lawyers give that advice is the great majority of their clients are guilty. And anything they say is going to either incriminate them or, bring on a perjury charge if they say it on the witness stand. Mm-hmm. So, of course, they tell them, don't tell the police anything. It's diametrically opposed to the strategy that the law-abiding citizen who was the innocent intended victim and fought back and reversed roles and put the perpetrator horizontal is going to need. Self-defense is an affirmative defense. And what we're saying is we're not saying I didn't do it. Mm-hmm. We're stipulating, yeah, I shot this guy, but I was absolutely correct in doing so. And real-world jury psychology, irrespective of what the black-letter law says, that shifts the burden of proof to the defendant. They're going to have to convince 12 ordinary people, many of whom don't know the difference between the word murder and the word homicide, that your attorney saying, yeah, my client shot him, doesn't mean that he murdered him. And they are going to have to get that across. First, they can expect to have to testify, because it's going to come down to why did you shoot him? And in the real world, only the defendant can truly fully answer that. When the innocent person who fired in self-defense uses the guilty man's strategy, the way I put it, if a guilty man's lawyer gives you a guilty man's strategy, you're going to end up with a guilty man's verdict. I've come to call it a false positive effect.
Yeah.
And the comparison that I give my students and that I'll give your listeners is this one. Let's say your listener listening to this right now was head of the emergency department at the level 1 trauma center. Mm-hmm. I come in as a patient and I am in extremis. It's obvious I'm going to die soon if something isn't done. Every single symptom I'm showing you is something that your medical school training and your extensive experience has taught you to correlate with disease A. It is likely that you will diagnose me with disease A. Mm-hmm. Therefore, you will treat me for disease A. But if it turns out the treatment for disease A is contraindicated for a B patient, what I've really got is disease B, I'm probably going to die from that. Okay. I tell them that's not medical malpractice. Under the reasonable man standard, any professional physician would have seen and correlated those symptoms exactly the same way, diagnosed them the same way, and treated them the same way.
Okay.
Now, what's that got to do with what we're talking about here? Let's come out of the emergency room and go out in the street.
Okay, I got about a minute, so go ahead.
You are violently attacked by a criminal. You shoot him and put him horizontal. From the first arriving cop, their history has been whoever's laying on the puddle of blood is the victim, whoever's got the smoking gun is the perpetrator. Check that box. You look like the perpetrator. Whoever was the innocent victim, the first thing they said was, that SOB did this to me, and I'll sign the complaint. I'll testify against them. And every guilty SOB they ever arrested, and they said, buddy, I'll hear your side of the story, told them, well, I ain't telling you nothing until I talk to my mouthpiece. What do you think they're going to correlate for symptoms, diagnosis, and treatment? What the street cop tells the detectives, what the detectives follow up on is what the prosecutor makes his decision on, and now you have that $600,000 legal bill to get you free after a year in jail without bail.
Where you could have said, he did this, I saw him throw something in the bushes over there, those people over there saw what's going on here, you need to talk to them, marshal your forces. All this is the kind of things that you talk about in your classes. Tell them where they can find out more about what you do, Mass.
MassadAyoobGroup.com. That's MassadAyoob Group.com.
MassadAyoobGroup.com. And I'm just going to tell you, it is worthwhile. It's more than worthwhile. It's worth more than the time and the money you spend on it. I'm just going to tell you. Mass, thank you so much. Always a pleasure.
Thank you, Tom. You and your listeners stay safe.
All righty, you too. Take care.